These are some of the most disturbing crimes that happened in the South Park community, and as the list goes on, each case gets even worse. South Park is an animated comedy series created by Trey Parker and Matt Stone that has been running on Comedy Central, which is a major American pay TV network, since 1997. And for over 2 decades, Trey and Matt built the show's reputation by being willing to go further than almost anything else on television, and its fan base grew just as fierce and devoted as the show itself. But what the creators would eventually discover about their own fandom was something far more unsettling than anything the show had ever put on screen. On June 23rd, 1999, South Park aired the 5th episode of its 3rd season, titled Tweek vs. Craig, and at the center of it were 2 of the show's least notable young characters. Craig Tucker was a young student known for wearing a blue chulo hat and for flipping people off, a habit he picked up from his family, all of whom share the same instinct. Tweek, on the other hand, was a classmate defined almost entirely by anxiety. He shook constantly, his eyes went wide at any sudden sound, and he had a habit of screaming, "Oh Jesus," at things that didn't necessarily warrant it.
God, oh Jesus!
In that episode, the boys were manipulated into a fight that neither of them wanted and ended up in a hospital together.
Hey guys, how you feeling?
That was the entirety of their shared history for the next 16 years, and beyond that single episode, the 2 barely had anything to do with each other. But more than 6 years after that episode aired, on October 22nd, 2005, a user by the name of Zombie Pip posted a fan art of Craig and Tweek depicted as a romantic couple on DeviantArt titled Tweek and Craig for Kindraka. And within the corner of the internet fandom that gravitates toward this kind of content, it gained a lot of attention, with more pieces following shortly after. The pairing was given a ship name, and the name was Creek, a combination of Craig and Tweek. For the next decade, Creek quietly accumulated one of the largest fan followings in the entire South Park fandom, competing for the top spot of fanfiction.net with only one other pairing called Style, which was the romantic pairing between the 2 best friends, Stan and Kyle, from the same show itself. However, the art being produced wasn't ordinary illustrations of 2 young characters standing next to each other. It was yaoi, a form of Japanese art created primarily by women that depicts male characters in romantic and intimate relationships. The content ranged from illustrations of the 2 holding hands all the way to far more mature material, and none of that was ambiguous to anyone producing it, because South Park had never hidden what Craig and Tweek were. They were elementary school students whose ages had been established clearly across 16 seasons of the show. A decade after the first DeviantArt post, by 2015, the art and fanfiction had spread across DeviantArt, Tumblr, fanfiction.net, and Archive of Our Own, where Creek had become the most popular pairing in the entire South Park fandom. Within the community, the standard practice was to age the characters up in fan works to avoid the issue of the characters' ages. However, that was a convention the community applied to itself without any outside enforcement, and it wasn't universally followed. But content depicting them as small humans existed alongside it, and none of it was hard to find. In late 2015, the writers at South Park found out about it, and rather than ignore it, they decided to do something about it. And so, on October 25th, 2015, South Park's official blog published a message addressed directly to its fans. It read, "Hey South Park fans, South Park is looking for a fan artwork to include this week's episode. Specifics, /yaoi Tweek plus Craig only. Submit by this Monday, October 26th at 6 p.m. Pacific Time. We'll try to use as much as we can." Fans had until Monday to submit. The episode aired that Wednesday, and by the time the deadline closed, over 1,500 pieces of art had come in. 3 days later, on October 28th, 2015, South Park aired the 6th episode of its 19th season titled Tweek x Craig, built entirely around what the fandom had been producing for the past decade. In the episode, a group of Asian girls at South Park Elementary began circulating yaoi artwork of Craig and Tweek around the school, and student body president Wendy Testerberger presented a slideshow of the art at a school assembly.
Tweek and Craig, forbidden love. What?
As the slideshows progressed, the pictures showed Craig and Tweek in increasingly romantic and inappropriate positions. All of the art in that slideshow was real, having been submitted by actual fans of the show and processed by the administrators at South Park Studios before being broadcast on national television. Both Craig and Tweek were horrified, with Tweek panicking and asking, "What if my parents find out?" And the two were pulled into PC Principal's office, where the principal ignored their insistence that they weren't actually engaged in inappropriate relations with one another, and instead lectured them, saying, "Principal, what matters, and the reason I brought you in here, is that you understand affirmative consent." The entire town responded to the owie by treating the two boys as an established couple, with Craig's father Thomas being congratulated at Whole Foods for having a gay son, and Tweek's parents celebrating over dinner and handing him money. A giant mural of the two was spray painted across the exterior of South Park Elementary, and an outdoor art fair appeared in town with hundreds of Creek pieces being sold by the Asian girls. The mayor was shown in her office, leafing through a stack of the artwork. Neither Craig nor Tweek wanted any of it, so Craig eventually proposed a plan where they would publicly announce they were together and then stage a breakup to put the whole thing to rest. Tweek agreed reluctantly, and the next day Craig began to fake breakup in front of their classmates, keeping his voice flat and saying their relationship simply wasn't going to work out. But Tweek got carried away and invented a fictional third party named Michael, accused Craig of cheating on him, and told Craig in front of everyone that he used people and stepped on them before running off in tears, leaving Craig standing there in disbelief.
We both know this is for the better. So you try and tell me what I want? I saw your text to Michael about hooking up with him. You just step on people and you use them. Well, guess what, Craig? Love doesn't follow a plan. Yeah!
The plan worked, but not in the way they intended. Rather than moving on, the town became consumed by what happened, and the cheerful yaoi of the two together was replaced almost overnight by somber murals depicting Tweek as a victim and Craig as a villain, while the art fair kept running. Craig, who had no relationships to begin with, was now broadly hated by his peers for a breakup he staged. Eventually, Craig's father Thomas told him that he could not fight who he was and gave him money. Craig then went to find Tweek, extended his hand without a word, and Tweek took it. The two walked down the street holding hands, and the episode ended with them sitting together in Craig's room playing a video game. A live-action segment followed, showing a Japanese man in a karaoke bar in Tokyo's Akihabara district singing a love song about Craig and Tweek in Japanese, produced specifically for the episode, and making Creep the first piece of fanfiction to ever be made canon in South Park's history. Now, the episode's ending left it genuinely unclear whether Craig and Tweek had developed real feelings or were still only performing for the town, but later on, that question was finally answered through the seasons that followed. In subsequent episodes, the two were shown holding hands in the background, and in the season 21 episode, Put It Down, which aired on September 20th, 2017, Craig called Tweek babe and honey on screen.
Okay, babe, what do you want to ride first? Week, honey. All week you've been freaking out, and I've been the one forced to deal with it.
Even more, in the 2021 post-COVID specials depicting the characters as adults, Craig and Tweek were shown married, with Craig also credited as the reason yaoi became a mainstream art form in the United States. AV Club gave the episode an A-, IGN gave it an 8.5, and critics framed it as a sharp satire about fandom culture and blind acceptance. But none of the critical reviews addressed the age issue at all. The show even received 2 Primetime Emmy Award nominations directly tied to the Creek relationship. The first came from Matt himself, nominated for Outstanding Character Voiceover Performance for voicing Craig in Tweek x Craig, though the award went to Family Guy's episode, Pilling Them Softly instead. 2 years later, the relationship earned the show a second nomination, this time for Outstanding Animated Program, for the season 21 episode Put It Down. Once again, South Park came up short, losing to Rick and Morty's Pickle Rick. But while the Creek controversy ended with 2 fictional children canonized as a couple and a fandom that only grew larger, the next case on this list begins with a single episode that aired on the wrong night, and what followed crossed oceans, landing on the desks of church leaders and heads of government before Comedy Central could contain it.
It's a miracle!
The South Park community has never been shy about rallying behind a show that has spent years making enemies of just about everyone willing to sit still long enough to be satirized. But in December of 2005, one episode managed to produce real-world consequences that reached far beyond anything even its most devoted defenders could have anticipated. On the 7th of December 2005, Comedy Central aired the final episode of the show's 9th season, titled Bloody Mary, and it landed on televisions the very evening before the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, which is a Catholic holy day set aside specifically in honor of the Virgin Mary. The episode followed Randy Marsh after a judge ordered him into the Alcoholics Anonymous following a drunk driving arrest, and once inside those meetings, Randy came away convinced that alcoholism was a disease and he had no power to control his own, and that he needed a miracle to recover.
You just need to not drink so much. It's very simple.
The only thing that will cure me is a miracle.
That miracle appeared to arrive just outside a church in Bailey, Colorado, where a roadside statue of the Virgin Mary had started dripping blood from between her legs, drawing in the sick and disabled from across the region, all of them lining up in hope of being healed. A cardinal dispatched from the Vatican arrived to examine it, stepped around the back of the statue, got sprayed across the face with blood, and declared it a genuine miracle on the spot, which only pushed the crowds larger still. Randy had his son Stan drive him directly there, cut to the front of the line by insisting his disease was worse than anyone else's, and was drenched in blood, after which he jumped up claiming he was cured and managed to stay sober for 5 days straight. Then Pope Benedict XVI, who had only assumed the papacy 8 months before this episode aired, flew in to investigate himself. He stepped behind the statue the same way the cardinal had, took the same spray of blood across his face, and after a closer inspection determined that the blood was not coming from the statue's rear end at all, but from her private part, delivering his conclusion plainly.
A chick bleeding out her private part is no miracle. Chicks bleed out their genital areas all the time.
Randy, devastated that no divine intervention had actually taken place, nearly turned straight back to drinking before Stan talked him into trying moderation instead.
Maybe I'll have 3 beers.
That's probably okay if you spread it out.
And the response came the very next morning. On December 8th, the episode got a lot of backlash when the Catholic League for Religious and Civil Rights, led by its president Bill Donahue, released a formal news statement demanding 2 things from Viacom, the parent company of Comedy Central. The first was a public apology to Catholics, and the second was a pledge to retire the episode permanently and withhold it from the Season 9 DVD release. Alongside that public demand, Bill reached out directly to Joseph A. Califano Jr., a practicing Catholic who sat on Viacom's board of directors and had previously served in the administrations of both President Johnson and Carter, posting Joseph's contact details on the league's website and asking its members to write to him. Joseph received the request and responded the same day. His written statement was brief and direct. He had viewed the segment and he found it, in his words,
"Today I viewed the South Park segment about our Blessed Mother. I found it an appalling and disgusting portrayal of the Virgin Mary. It's particularly troubling to me as a Roman Catholic that a segment has run on the eve and day of the feast of the Immaculate Conception, a holy day for Roman Catholics. I've talked to Tom Freston, the president and chief executive of the new Viacom, and asked him to review this show and determine whether any action should be taken."
2 weeks after the episode first aired, on December 21st, 2005, Bishop William Skylstad, who at the time was serving as president of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, the national body that speaks for and coordinates Americans' Catholic bishops, added his own formal weight to the campaign. He sent a letter to Tom accusing the network of showing what he called
extreme insensitivity
by airing the episode. The Catholic League pressed on as well, with Bill's vice president Bernadette Brady calling Tom's office on December 28th and giving them a hard deadline to respond by December 30th or see their silence reported publicly in the league's upcoming newsletter. Tom's office made no public statement, but Comedy Central moved quietly on December 28th, airing a full marathon rebroadcast of the 9th season that evening and removing Bloody Mary from the lineup without any announcement or explanation. The following day, December 29th, the network's executive vice president for corporate communications, Tony Fox, called Bill personally and confirmed there were no plans to ever rerun the episode, and UPI carried the story nationally the day after that, with every press image from Bloody Mary disappearing from Comedy Central's official press site and from the South Park section of the network's website around the same time, wiped clean without comment. Comedy Central stopped well short of a full concession, though, because when reporters emailed to ask whether the episode had been formally retired from the DVD release, the network said no, insisting it would still appear on the Season 9 DVD exactly as it had originally aired. Bill publicly credited Comedy Central for making the right call, but he also revealed that the Catholic League had spent the past weeks receiving what he described as a flood of hate mail that was viciously anti-Catholic in nature. All of it, he maintained, was in response to nothing more than a straightforward request to stop the network from insulting their faith a second time. But 2 months later, by February 2006, 2006, the controversy had spread well beyond the United States, as leaders from the New Zealand Catholic Bishops' Conference joined the Council of Christians and Muslims along with several other religious groups to lobby the media company CanWest into cancelling a planned broadcast of the episode on the New Zealand music channel C4, and CanWest rejected the request. The bishops called for the full boycott of C4 and its sister network TV3, but CanWest brushed that off too, instead pulling the broadcast forward to an earlier date to capitalise on the media attention the dispute was generating. Even New Zealand's own Prime Minister, Helen Clark, weighed in, calling the episode revolting while still making clear the network was within its rights to air it. One advertiser pulled out of CanWest's networks entirely, and a Catholic organisation called Family Life International launched a dedicated website to push a coordinated boycott of the company's remaining advertisers. Then, on the evening before the scheduled broadcast, things took an odd turn. A company that had nothing to do with the C4 music channel, but happened to share the name C4 Productions, rushed to the court for an emergency court injunction to block the airing, arguing the confusion between the two organizations would damage its business. However, a judge wasn't convinced and rejected the application that same day. C4 broadcast the episode as planned on February 22, 2006, and 210,000 viewers tuned in that night, 6 times the channel's normal South Park audience for that time slot. And a month later, after receiving 102 formal complaints from viewers, the network put out a statement acknowledging the depth of feeling over the broadcast and apologizing for any offense caused, while stopping short of saying the decision to air it had been wrong. 4 months later, in June of 2006, New Zealand Broadcasting Standards Authority, which is the government body that rules on complaints against television and radio broadcasters, went through all 102 complaints and dismissed every single one, finding the episode too over the top and cartoonish to count as the kind of attack on religion that broadcasting standards were designed to prevent. The New Zealand Catholic bishops weren't satisfied, and they responded by announcing they would appeal the finding. While all of that was playing out across the Pacific, Australia had been running its own parallel version of the same standoff, with Melbourne's Archbishop Dennis Hart writing to the network's SBS in February of 2006 to ask them not to broadcast the episode, and SBS's programming director initially turned him down before reversing course, citing the reason for postponing the broadcast as the international unrest breaking out at the time over Danish newspaper cartoons that depicted the Islamic prophet Muhammad, which resulted in riots and clashes that left 250 people dead. Back in the United States, The Daily Show gave the whole situation its own treatment on March 14, 2006, with correspondent Rob Corddry joking that Christian outrage had evolved past executions and now ran instead through strongly worded letters sent up a corporate chain, and that the process could still move even a network like Comedy Central. While he spoke, the show ran a clip reel of South Park content that had aired without drawing a single formal complaint: cats mating on screen, a man vomiting and then landing face first in it, and a scene of Butters witnessing acts committed without consent. Not 1 second of Bloody Mary appeared in the reel. On August 2, 2006, Comedy Central rebroadcast Bloody Mary in the United States regardless, doing exactly what it had told the Catholic League 7 months earlier it would not do, and Bill put out a statement that same night calling the network out for breaking its word. Comedy Central, he said, had not fulfilled its promise. He then turned to what he saw as the contradiction at the heart of the network's decision, arguing that the same people who had just rebroadcast a cartoon pope being sprayed with blood from a Virgin Mary statue were the same people to that day still refused to air so much as a single image of the Prophet Muhammad, and the reason, in his view, was simple. They knew that if they did, some Muslims might end them. And on August 30th, 2006, 28 days after the American rerun, SBS finally broadcast the episode in Australia as well. And even though everything in that controversy played out in the open, with formal statements and press coverage and regulatory bodies weighing in on the record, the next case on this list unfolded in exactly the opposite way, since it was carried out entirely behind closed doors, and Trey and Matt had no idea any of it was happening until the proof of it surfaced years later.
You see, Stan, there is a reason for people feeling sad and depressed. An alien reason.
The Church of Scientology built itself around a strict hierarchy of spiritual levels that its members paid enormous sums to climb, with the most closely guarded teachings reserved only for those who made it to the very top, and it wasn't a church that took kindly to anyone pulling those teachings into the open. So when South Park decided to do exactly that, the response was never going to be small. On November 16, 2005, the show aired an episode putting Scientology's upper-level doctrine on national television for millions of viewers to see, alongside one of the religion's most famous members, Tom Cruise.
It's me, Tom Cruise!
You're not like as good as Leonardo DiCaprio, but you're okay, I guess.
Ah!
Hey, Dad! Tom Cruise won't come out of the closet!
and within months, the church's Office of Special Affairs, the division responsible for going after its critics, had opened an investigation into the two men behind it, Trey and Matt. Before any of that surveillance got underway though, the church considered something far more direct, as internal records show Scientology leadership had weighed suing Trey and Matt outright, but backed off once it became clear the case wouldn't hold up in court. Instead, they turned their attention to Mark Ebner, an investigative journalist who had consulted on the episode and had a long history of reporting on the church. Rather than going after Trey and Matt directly, OSA accused the journalist of using the show to settle a personal vendetta and tried to open a formal investigation into him, using what the church internally calls the third-party law. L. Ron Hubert's theory that any conflict between two people is secretly being stirred up by a third party behind the scenes. It went nowhere though, and the journalist continued consulting for Comedy Central without a single interruption. However, that failure didn't stop the church from moving further. By April of 2006, the investigation had grown into a full surveillance operation on the South Park production offices themselves. Internal documents that would only surface years later show private investigators casing the building, learning which catering company the crew used for lunch, mapping out where Trey and Matt parked, and logging the make, model, and license plate number of each of their cars. Even more, a report dated April 24, 2006, laid out just how much the operation had learned about the people working around them and recommended the next move. Since watching The Office wasn't turning up anything usable, it was time to go through the people closest to them instead. That's where Eric Sherman came in, a film consultant and Scientologist who had been quietly talking to Lloyd Kaufman, the founder of Troma Studios and a longtime friend of Trey and Matt, fishing for information through their professional circle. Through those conversations, the documents claim, OSA identified a short list of people close to the South Park creators: writer Matt Prager, actor John Stamos, his then-wife actress Rebecca Romaine, and writer David Goodman. The church then began running what the paperworks call a PCR, a public records check, on each of them. That meant pulling property filings, legal records, and anything else on file that could expose a debt, a lawsuit, or an arrest the church could use as leverage. Lloyd would also deny ever handing Sherman those names at all, insisting he barely knew who Stamos and Romaine even were. Whether Lloyd gave up the names or not, the plan had already been built to go further, because if the public record search came up empty, the next step was what OSA internally calls special collections, the church's own team for going through someone's trash. Marty Rathbun, who ran operations like this one for years before defecting in 2004, then described to the Village Voice exactly what investigators are trained to pull from a person's garbage: phone bills, bank statements, personal letters, prescriptions, and even the brand and quality of alcohol someone drinks, telling reporter Tony Ortega that they can find out a lot about you through your trash. A private investigator named Mark Chaupeter would then confirm he'd done exactly that kind of work for the church in 2006, during the same window this operation was running, and Mike Rinder, who led OSA for more than 20 years before leaving in 2007, as well as Marty, confirmed this was standard procedure, not an isolated incident. Then, on May 3rd, 2006, the operation moved further still, as a newly surfaced document showed OSA had connected with a young filmmaker, a recent college graduate who had studied under Eric Sherman and had just interviewed Lloyd himself. According to that memo, the filmmaker agreed to try to get hired at the South Park studio, whether as an intern or a writer, so he could establish a direct line of communication inside the production and report back on what Trey and Matt were planning. The church wasn't just watching the two men from a distance anymore, because it was now trying to put someone directly inside their own writer's room. What happened after that document is where the trail runs out, since the surfaced records never confirm whether any of it actually worked. Either way, the surveillance stretched on for well over a year without anyone outside the church having any idea it was happening. But that changed in October of 2011, when Marty Rathbun, who had spent the years since his defection publicly criticizing church leader David Miscavige, began posting the leaked OSA documents on his blog and handing more of them to journalist Tony Ortega at the Village Voice. Over the following days, more memos kept surfacing: the failed case against the journalist, the stakeout of the production office, the friends being run through public records, and the plan to plant a mole inside the writer's room, all of it laid out in the church's own internal paperwork. When Scientology spokesperson Karen Powell was asked to respond, she said, "You're being led down the primrose path by a couple of liars posting sensationalistic rumors on a small-time blog. This isn't a story, I'm sorry." But what she never did was deny that any of it happened. To this day, neither Trey nor Matt have ever publicly commented on the investigation, and the documents Rathbun leaked remain the only confirmation that any of it took place at all. Now, even though the Scientology investigation had one clear target and a single organization driving it, the next case on this list had neither, and what was done to one of the show's most beloved cast members was carried out instead by the people closest to him, in a way that left him no way to stop it.
And so Isaac went to Trey Parker and Matt Stone in tears and said, "They're trying to get me to quit, and I can't do this anymore."
Isaac Hayes was a 65-year-old soul legend who had won an Academy Award for Theme from Shaft, the iconic theme song to the 1971 blaxploitation film of the same name, and built his career writing hits at Stax Records, which is one of Memphis's most celebrated soul labels. He spent 9 years lending his voice to Chef on South Park, the school cafeteria cook who handed the kids of South Park Elementary School advice, and became one of the show's most beloved characters since the series premiered in 1997. Creators Trey and Matt approached him for the role, never really expecting him to say yes, and he said yes anyway. But Isaac was also a devoted member of the Church of Scientology, and on November 16th, 2005, that part of his life collided head-on with the show he loved, when South Park aired an episode called Trapped in the Closet on Comedy Central. The episode tore into Scientology in explicit detail, mocking the religion's teachings about Xenu, a galactic ruler who Scientology believed imprisoned souls on Earth millions of years ago, and implying that two of its most famous members, John Travolta and Tom Cruise, were secretly gay. Trey and Matt deliberately left Chef out of the episode so that Isaac couldn't be held responsible for it airing, but Isaac still reached out to Matt after it aired, and during that call, Matt said it became obvious that someone had sent Isaac to ask him to pull the episode. Nothing came out of it publicly though, since there was no statement, no backlash, and according to his son, Isaac III, the episode simply wasn't a big deal at the time. That changed 2 months later when Isaac suffered a stroke in January of 2006 that, according to Isaac III, left his father unable to speak and forced him to relearn basic functions, including how to play the piano. Isaac III said his father didn't have much comprehension left either, and in his words,
Isaac was in no position to resign from anything.
But that March, while Isaac was still in the middle of that recovery, Comedy Central re-aired Trapped in the Closet, and according to Isaac III, that re-air is what finally made the Church of Scientology very upset. On March 13th, 2006, a statement went out under Isaac's name announcing his resignation from South Park, reading,
"There is a place in this world for satire, but there is a time when satire ends, and intolerance and bigotry toward religious beliefs of others begins. As a civil rights activist of the past 40 years, I cannot support a show that disrespects those beliefs and practices."
The statement never mentioned Scientology by name, and Matt said it made them look like bigots for mocking someone's religion, when according to Trey, something far darker was actually happening behind the scenes. Isaac III said his father never wrote a word of that statement, since the people surrounding Isaac at the time, his publicists and his management, were almost entirely Scientologists themselves, and it was those people who made the decision to leave the show, not Isaac. Isaac III also said his father would have never quit on his own, since he loved Trey and Matt, loved the character, and was making a lot of money doing it, but losing that income meant Isaac was pushed back out on tour before he had recovered enough to handle it. Isaac never publicly disputed the statement, and 2 years after that resignation on August 10th, 2008, his wife, his young son, and his wife's cousin returned home from the grocery store and found him collapsed on the floor of a downstairs bedroom next to a treadmill that was still running. And after a sheriff's deputy administered CPR until paramedics arrived, Isaac was rushed to Baptist East Hospital in Memphis, where he was pronounced dead a little after 2 p.m., 10 days before he would have turned 66. Medical examiners then listed the cause of death as a recurrence of stroke, the same condition that had left him unable to speak or make decisions for himself, in the exact window his resignation was written and released in his name. For almost 10 years, the public had no reason to question any of it. Then in 2016, Isaac III told The Hollywood Reporter, a major American entertainment trade publication,
"Isaac Hayes did not quit South Park. Someone quit South Park for him."
Matt responded directly, saying,
"We sort of figured out the whole picture a bit later, but that's totally what happened. It really sucked, the whole thing."
Trey added that he and Matt had always suspected something was deeply wrong behind the resignation. 9 years later, in July of 2025, Isaac III went further in an interview with Cracked, an American comedy and pop culture website, and said that the people controlling Isaac's career and public statements were Scientologists who didn't believe in modern medicine and favored holistic treatment instead, adding that this likely likely meant Isaac wasn't even taking the medication he needed during that period. When asked whether being forced back on tour had accelerated his father's death, Isaac III answered without hesitation.
Yes, 100%.
Although what happened to Isaac was carried out by the people closest to him, the next case on this list had no single person and no organization behind it at all, and it spread far beyond anything one group could have controlled, hurting real people in the process over nothing more than a single episode.
Police are investigating a series of bizarre and disturbing attacks that have left children in cities from coast to coast injured and fearing for their safety.
It was November 20th, 2008, and a redhead student, who we'll call Jake, at DP Todd Secondary School in Prince George, British Columbia, arrived at school and spent the next several hours being kicked by classmates he had known for years. But as it turned out, he wasn't the only one. 3 years before that morning, on November 9th, 2005, Comedy Central aired the 11th episode of South Park's 9th season. The episode was titled Ginger Kids, and it was written and directed by series co-creator Trey. In it, the character Eric Cartman stood before his 4th grade class and delivered a presentation, telling his classmates that people born with red hair, pale skin, and freckles suffered from a condition he called gingivitis. He described them as disgusting and inhuman, incapable of surviving in sunlight, and, most notably, born entirely without souls. Now, the episode's intent was satirical, since Eric was meant to look like the Fool, and the show made sure of it by having Stan and Kyle turn Eric red-headed and pale after he did a report on how dangerous red-headed children were. By the episode's end, Eric had experienced the same prejudice from the other side after his friend secretly dyed his hair red and painted freckles onto his face while he slept, and his reaction, launching an extremist movement, was played entirely for horror and absurdity. Trey and Matt had reportedly spent a long time searching for the right vehicle for this kind of episode, and were partly inspired by a billboard they had seen in England that read,
"Only you can prevent ginger."
Over the years that followed, ginger moved from a British colloquialism into a widely used slur in North America, and gingers don't have souls became a phrase that spread through internet culture the way those things do, shared and reshared across message boards and early social media until it had completely detached from the episode that produced it. And then, in November 2008, someone decided that a joke wasn't enough. In the days leading up to November 20th, 2008, a Facebook group appeared called
National Kick a Ginger Day. Are you going to do it?
And the instructions required no interpretation, since members were asked to find the red-headed people in their schools and their lives and kick them, with the target date circled in advance, November 20th. Within days, the group had grown to nearly 5,000 members spread across Canada and the United States, and its message wall had split neatly between two kinds of posts, some members pledging to participate and others red-headed students who expressed their outrage. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police investigators from the Comox Valley in British Columbia traced the group back to a teenage boy from Courtenay, BC, who had taken over the group's administration from another user. When officers arrived at his home and interviewed him alongside his parents, he apologized, telling them the group was a joke and that he'd never intended for anyone to get hurt. Shortly after, RCMP spokeswoman Constable Tammy Douglas told reporters that the group's creation did not, in a strict legal sense, constitute a hate crime on its own, but that the content it had hosted, the pledges to kick people and the incitement to physical violence, was what her department had opened an investigation into. Several days had passed, and on November 20th, young students with red hair across Canada walked into school. Back at DP Todd Secondary School in Prince George, Jake had been kicked 18 times before staff intervened and sent him home. Lynn Hall, the chairman of the Prince George School Board, told reporters it was
absolutely ridiculous and disgusting.
Then, on Vancouver Island at Journey Middle School in Souk, 20 students were sent home for kicking red-haired classmates throughout the school day. The school's assistant, Superintendent Jim Cambridge, said the principal had sat down with the students involved and worked through the connection between what they had done and the kind of discrimination they were presumably being taught to oppose, asking them to brainstorm how they intended to make restitution through apology and community action. Then, in Calgary, a city in Alberta, Canada, the day turned genuinely violent. At St. Francis High School, a grade 10 boy with red hair walked into the locker room after gym class and was surrounded by 13 students who beat him. He was taken to the hospital where staff documented bruising across his upper body. Calgary police opened a hate crime investigation within hours of the incident, with spokesperson Kevin Brookwell stating directly,
"The fact of the matter is, from a policing perspective, it is a hate crime. and this individual was targeted because of the fact they have red hair.
Elsewhere in the city, 2 redhead grade 7 girls at St. Alphonsus Elementary School were swarmed and kicked repeatedly by older female students, resulting in 2 additional suspensions. At Cardinal Newman, another Calgary school, an undisclosed further number of students were also disciplined. And far to the northwest, a teacher named Tulani Ackerman at Prince Rupert Secondary School told CBC News that her younger brother, who had attended a high school in the Kootenays, a region in southeastern British Columbia, had been kicked in the groin by classmates before fleeing the building. In the months that followed, the St. Francis High School case moved through the Calgary youth court system. 2 of the 15-year-old boys who had taken part in the locker room assault pleaded guilty to 1 count each of assault, and by the time the sentencing came around, one had completed community service and the other had made a donation to a youth club. Both had written letters of apology to the boy they had beaten, and the court noted on record that the victim was still dealing with the aftermath of what they had done. Judge Lynn Cookstanhope gave both teenagers absolute discharges, but before she could close the case, she turned her attention to what she believed had set it in motion. South Park, she told the court, was
a vulgar, socially irreverent program that contributes nothing to society.
And, unfortunately, she added,
the writers and producers of the show will never be called to account for encouraging such action.
And an absolute discharge, by the way, is the most lenient sentence a court can hand down for a criminal conviction. The verdict and judge's remarks received wide coverage, and then November 20th came again. In 2009, at A.E. Wright Middle School in Calabasas, California, a 13-year-old student sent a Facebook message to his classmate declaring that November 20th was
Kick a Ginger Day.
And within that same school, a young boy with red hair and freckles was attacked twice, with as many as 14 students involved across both incidents. Los Angeles County Sheriff Lieutenant Richard Erickson confirmed that the boy was
kicked and hit with fists in various areas of his body,
while a 6th grade girl was kicked in the legs from behind by classmates she never saw coming. And by the end of the day, 7 students in total had reported being kicked or shoved by 7th and 8th graders who had read the message. School District Superintendent Donald Zimring, speaking to reporters afterward, noted that accounts differed on what had happened to one of the victims after he was on the ground, with some suggesting he had been kicked in the groin or head before being able to get up. He also said,
anytime a youngster gets hurt because of a thoughtless act, there ought to be consequences.
The school held assemblies the following Monday to address the situation with the student body. 3 boys were subsequently arrested, 2 12-year-olds booked on suspicion of misdemeanor battery, and a 13-year-old who had sent the initial message detained for misdemeanor cyberbullying. Though investigators identified 8 boys in total as having participated. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Office confirmed in its investigation that the apparent inspiration traced back to the 2005 South Park episode, which had now produced, in the span of 2 consecutive November 20ths, incidents in multiple Canadian provinces and a major Los Angeles suburb. However, the physical harassment didn't stop there. On September 30th, 2011, at Lesser High School in Tecumseh, Ontario, a girl named Gwendolyn Russell was repeatedly kicked by a group of grade 9 students throughout the school day because she was a redhead. Some of those involved were members of the school's football team, and their punishment from school administrators amounted to a 1-game suspension. Gwendolyn's mother, Samantha, spoke publicly about what she saw as a disparity in how the situation had been handled.
If it was Kick a Black Kid Day or Kick a Gay Kid Day,
Samantha told reporters,
those kids would have been suspended from school immediately. The school touts that they have a zero policy for violence, yet a suspension from a football game does not seem like a zero tolerance policy.
The school's board superintendent of human resources, Joseph Pickard, declined to confirm or deny the specific punishment, describing the matter as an ongoing internal issue and stating that
not all the information being portrayed is accurate.
2 years after that, in October 2013, the assaults crossed the Atlantic, when at least 6 red-haired students at Winfield Academy in Rotherham, Yorkshire, reported being targeted by classmates who had seen the circulating November 20th material. Their parents formed a Facebook group in response, posting photographs of their children's bruises and making the damage visible to the public. One mother, who chose not to give her name, described the phone call she had received in the middle of a school day.
My son rang me and said kids were kicking him, saying it was National Kick a Ginger Kid Day.
She told Fox News,
he was scared, so I went to get him out of school. My son's legs are swollen and there are bruises coming through.
Wingfield Academy issued a statement calling the incident
deplorable acts
and confirmed that the students responsible had been
strongly reprimanded,
while warning the entire student body that anyone continuing to participate would face further punishment. punishment. Authorities noted at the time that websites were still actively promoting November 20th as the official date, and that the annual cycle showed no sign of stopping on its own. On November 20th, 2015, the 7th grade students from Melrose Veterans Memorial Middle School in Melrose, Massachusetts, targeted their redhead peers Friday morning by kicking them in the hallways and stairwells while students moved between classes, injuring several before school officials and local police launched an investigation. No staff or faculty witnessed students being kicked in the halls, but the administration became aware of the incidents when injured students went to the nurse, according to the school statement. The school conducted disciplinary hearings in the days that followed, and tolerance seminars were held for the student body. In the years that followed, reports of organized Kick a Ginger Day assaults gradually disappeared. Schools that had once dealt with annual incidents issued warnings before November 20th, police had investigated several of the most serious attacks, and the Facebook group that helped spread the idea was long gone. But unlike anything else on this list so far, the next case cost the lives of many, and South Park was dragged into it before anyone even had time to ask why.
The investigation into the high school massacre is slow-moving and dangerous. The two gunmen who went on the rampage booby-trapped the building and even themselves.
At 11:19 in the morning on April 20th, 1999, two senior students walked toward Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado, wearing long black trench coats with weapons strapped underneath, and within the next 49 minutes, they would carry out one of the deadliest school shootings in American history. But while the country searched for a reason why two teenagers could do something so horrific, the finger of blame would eventually land somewhere nobody expected, on a crudely animated cartoon about four foul-mouthed kids from Colorado. The two students had been planning this attack for roughly a year before it had happened, and their original plan wasn't even to shoot anyone. Their journals show that they intended this to be primarily a bombing, with the shooting only meant as a backup, and over the course of that year, the pair built a total of 99 bombs between them, including 27 pipe bombs, 48 CO2 cartridges packed with gunpowder, 7 Molotov cocktails, and 14 propane tanks converted into explosives. Two of those propane bombs, each weighing 29 pounds, about 9 kilograms, and rigged with attached pipe bombs, were placed inside duffel bags and planted in the cafeteria, set to detonate at around 11:17 a.m., the busiest lunch period of the day. Had they gone off as planned, investigators believed the explosion would have ended or severely wounded most of the 488 students eating lunch at the time, and potentially collapsed the library above the cafeteria down onto them. But at 14 minutes past 11 that morning, when those bombs were supposed to detonate, nothing happened, since the timers had failed. Forced back on their secondary plan, the two changed into their trench coats and walked separately back toward the school, each carrying a 9mm firearm and a sawed-off shotgun. As one of them crossed the parking lot, he ran into a classmate named Brooks Brown, who he'd recently patched things up with after a long-running feud. Brooks was surprised to see him, since he had been absent from a test that morning, and when he pointed this out, the student simply replied,
"It doesn't matter anymore,"
before telling Brooks,
"I like you now. Get out of here. Go home."
So, feeling uneasy, Brooks walked away down the street. It was at 19 minutes past 11 on the morning of April the 20th that the two seniors, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, opened fire outside the west entrance. As they approached, Dylan threw a pipe bomb toward the parking lot. It only partially detonated, letting off a cloud of smoke, and many of the students nearby assumed it was a senior prank. Rachel Scott, who was a junior, was sitting on the grass with her friend Richard Castaldo, having lunch outside like any other Tuesday, and neither of them had any reason to think otherwise. Then, Eric raised his carbine rifle and shot her 4 times from just 10 to 15 feet away, or 3 to 4.5 meters. The 4th round struck her in the head, and she died there on the grass, becoming the first person to leave this world on that day. Richard was shot 8 times across the chest, arm, and abdomen by both Eric and Dylan, and he fell unconscious, left paralyzed from the chest down. From there, they moved toward the stairs, where 3 students were climbing toward them. Believing the weapons were just paintball guns, the students continued up the staircase. Eric took off his trench coat and opened fire, unleashing 10 rounds that ended Daniel Robo, who was a freshman, and left Sean Graves seriously wounded. Eric and Dylan then moved through the school, firing on students in the halls and setting off pipe bombs as they went. A teacher named Dave Sanders, along with 2 custodians, was moving through the same hallways, warning students to get under the tables and guiding them up the staircase to the 2nd floor, away from the shooters. He was at the end of a hallway, gesturing for students near the library to stay put, when Eric and Dylan came around the corner. Eric fired twice, hitting Dave in the back and neck. Dave collapsed, and a student in a nearby science room pulled him inside and tried to keep him alive, propping a sign in the window that read,
"One bleeding to death."
Dave wasn't reached by paramedics for hours, and he eventually died, becoming the one teacher ended that day. 29 minutes into the attack, Eric and Dylan entered the school library where 52 students, 2 teachers and 2 librarians were hiding under desks and tables. Over the next 7.5 minutes, the pair moved through the room table by table. Eric announced that anyone wearing a white hat or a sports emblem was in trouble. Wearing a white hat was an athlete's tradition at Columbine, and more than a few students quietly slipped theirs off and hid them beneath their desks. Eric shot and ended Stephen Kernow, who was a freshman, and a junior named Cassie Bernal, who had been asked if she believed in God, to which she responded yes, before Eric pulled the trigger, as well as wounding several others. At another table, Dylan found Craig Scott, Matthew Kechter, and Isaiah Scholes hiding together. Upon spotting Isaiah, who was black, Dylan called out a racial slur before taunting him further, then shot and killed him. Matthew was killed at the same table, while Craig survived by playing dead, laying in the blood of his friends. In total, Eric and Dylan ended 10 people in that library: Kyle Velasquez, Stephen Kernow, Cassie Bernal, Isaiah Scholes, Matthew Kechter, Lauren Townsend, John Tomlin, Kelly Fleming, Daniel Morza, and Corey DePuta, and wounded 12 others before walking back out at around 11:36. For the next half hour, they moved through the school, setting small fires and lobbing pipe bombs down the hallways. But at 11:44 a.m., the two made their way back to the cafeteria and attempted once more to detonate the propane bombs they had placed hours earlier, even firing directly at the duffel bags. To their surprise, however, the explosives still refused to go off. Eventually, they returned to the library, where at 8 minutes past noon, Eric and Dylan turned their weapons onto themselves. Eric was found slumped against a bookshelf with his sawn-off shotgun between his legs. Dylan lay nearby on the floor, his Tech-9, a semi-automatic pistol, still beside him. When it was over, Eric and Dylan had ended 12 students and 1 teacher, and wounded 20 others by gunfire, with 3 more injured in the chaos of the evacuation. Between them, they had fired 188 rounds over the course of 49 minutes. The investigation into how something like this could happen began almost immediately, even as police were still pulling survivors out through windows and doorways that morning. News cameras were already rolling, and somewhere in that chaos, officers picked up a tall, brown-haired 17-year-old named Chris Morris and walked him to a van in handcuffs. Chris wasn't a stranger to Eric and Dylan, and by the time investigators finished piecing together his connection to the two of them, it was easy to see why he'd been pulled aside that day. He worked alongside both of them at a local pizza place, and he was close enough to Dylan that some considered him one of his best friends. In the months before the massacre, Eric had tried to recruit him as a third shooter, and had even asked if Chris would store homemade napalm at his house. The investigators would also learn that Eric had once shown him a homemade explosive disguised as a tripwire bomb, that Chris had been seen with pipe bombs weeks before the shooting, and that he'd spent time at a gun range with Eric and Dylan using the very same weapons used in the massacre. None of that meant Chris had any part in what happened, since he said no to Eric both times, brushing it off as Eric just talking, and he had no idea that they were planning an attack. The moment he found out, he reported himself to 911 right away. When officers searched him that day, what Chris had underneath his trench coat and beret was a plain black t-shirt featuring the South Park character Kenny, printed with the words, "Many deaths of Kenny." Within hours, that single detail had made its way into news coverage of the massacre, and the story spread fast. One of the suspects detained near Columbine had been wearing a South Park shirt. Matt and Trey were left bracing for the fallout from a cartoon that had never been accused of inspiring real-world violence before. Trey would say he was relieved when a sheriff publicly pointed out that plenty of kids being pulled out of the building that day were wearing South Park shirts too, since the brand was simply one of the most popular among American teenagers at the time, but by then the connection had already taken hold in the public imagination, and the show found itself dragged into a national conversation about what had driven 2 teenagers to commit mass murder. 2 months after the shooting, on June 23rd, 1999, Matt and Trey released South Park Bigger, Longer and Uncut, a feature film already in production long before Columbine had ever happened. Matt took 3 days off work once the news broke, admitting that nothing felt funny to him in the aftermath, and the timing of the film's release meant it now arrived into a country actively debating whether shows like South Park bore some responsibility for what had happened. That conversation only grew louder in 2002, when filmmaker Michael Moore released Bowling for Columbine, a documentary investigating the causes behind the massacre. Michael traveled to Littleton and sat down one with Matt, who had grown up in the area and whose own high school had once played Columbine in sports. Matt walked Michael through what it had been like growing up there, the kind of social environment that surrounded kids like Eric and Dylan, and by his own account, Michael never twisted his words or misrepresented anything he said on camera. Michael followed Matt's segment with a crude, hand-drawn animated short about the history of guns in America, one that traced an invented connection between the Ku Klux Klan and the founding of the National Rifle Association. Matt had nothing to do with that cartoon, and neither did Trey, but the short was deliberately drawn in a style that closely mirrored South Park's own construction paper aesthetic, and placed directly after Matt's interview, it left audiences with the impression that the two men behind South Park were the ones who made it. He then called it a clear example of how Michael operated as a filmmaker, saying he didn't need to explicitly state something to make the audiences believe it, since cutting two unrelated pieces of footage back to back was enough to create a meaning that was never actually there. Chris himself was released on the day of the shooting without being charged, and investigators ultimately cleared him of any involvement in planning the attack, though the questions surrounding him that day never fully went away. While the connection between South Park and Columbine faded into the background of public memory, the final case on this list begins with a post on a radical website addressed directly to Trey and Matt, and what that post contained alongside it made clear that whoever wrote it wasn't simply angry at a cartoon.
A threat against the creators of South Park, a warning by a radical Islamic group right here in America, right here in New York, that they will end up dead because of a cartoon.
On the night of April 21st, 2010, viewers who tuned into Comedy Central for that week's episode of South Park noticed almost immediately that something was wrong. Audio bleeps kept cutting in and out over lines of dialogue that had nothing to do with profanity. A large black rectangle labeled censored appeared on screen every time a specific character walked into frame, and when the episode finally reached its closing minutes, during a speech delivered by 3 of the show's main characters, a single unbroken bleep ran for nearly 35 consecutive seconds, drowning out the entire thing. None of it was a technical error. Comedy Central had made a deliberate decision, and the events that forced it had put South Park at the center of the most dangerous confrontation in the show's decade-long history. It was April 14th, 2010, the night South Park aired its 200th episode, that it all began. For 14 years prior to that broadcast, South Park had operated on a simple and consistent philosophy, one where nothing was off limits and no one was exempt. And in that time, the show had depicted Jesus Christ in all manners of irreverent scenarios, mocking Scientology so specifically that it named individual celebrities on screen, lampooned Catholic clergy, ridiculed Mormon theology, and satirized virtually every political figure who had passed through American public life. None of those episodes had ever produced a credible threat of violence against the show's creators, Trey and Matt. There was, however, one subject that had always carried a different kind of tension. Since at least 2005, Comedy Central had maintained an informal policy against depicting the Prophet Muhammad on screen, a position it made explicit during a 2006 two-part episode called Cartoon Wars. That episode had dealt directly with the censorship question itself, centering on whether a fictional episode of Family Guy would be allowed to show an image of Muhammad. Comedy Central blocked the image and replaced it with a text card explaining the decision. Trey and Matt had been openly critical of the move, viewing it as a double standard given that every other religious figure appeared on their show without restriction. So when the show's milestone 200th episode arrived, Trey and Matt decided to revisit the question more directly than they had before. The plot of 200 brought back nearly every celebrity and public figure the show had previously mocked, waving them into a lawsuit against the town of South Park. Threaded through all of it was a storyline in which the Prophet Muhammad was needed in person. To get around the obvious problem, the episode depicted him hidden inside a bear costume the entire time, never revealing his actual form. Even that precaution had been enough for the episode to air untouched by the network, but it wasn't, as it turned out, enough for everyone watching. Within a week of the April 14th broadcast, a post appeared on a website called revolutionmuslim.com, addressed directly to Trey and Matt. It had been jointly written by the site's founder and one of its most active contributors. The site had been founded in December 2007 by Jesse Curtis Morton, a 29-year-old Columbia University graduate and a co-founder named Yusuf al-Khattab. From the beginning, Revolution Muslim had existed to promote a radical Islamist ideology. It ran propaganda supportive of Al-Qaeda, published content praising Osama bin Laden, celebrated the September 11 attacks, and had been among the few American websites to applaud the November 2009 Fort Hood shooting, in which a US Army psychiatrist opened fire on his fellow soldiers and ended 13 people. The post about South Park had been co-written by a 20-year-old contributor who went online under the username Abu Talha al-Amriki. His legal name was Zachary Adam Chesser, and he had grown up about 20 minutes outside Washington, D.C. in Fairfax County, Virginia. The text of the post was written carefully, but its message was clear. Zachary and Jesse warned Trey and Matt, saying,
"What they are doing is stupid, and they will probably wind up like Theo Van Gogh for airing this show."
Then came the line that every news organization would quote in the days that followed.
"This is not a threat, but a warning of the reality of what will likely happen to them."
For anyone who didn't know who Theodore Van Gogh, better known as Theo, was, the warning probably didn't mean much, but anyone who did know exactly what Zachary and Jesse were implying. Theo was a Dutch filmmaker, a descendant of the brother of the painter Vincent van Gogh, and by 2004 one of the most controversial cultural figures in the Netherlands. That year, he had directed a short film called Submission, written by Somali-born Dutch politician Ayaan Hirsi Ali, which examined the lives of women living under strict interpretations of Islamic law. The film was less than 11 minutes long, aired on Dutch public television, and drew violent responses almost immediately. On the morning of November 2nd, 2004, Theo was cycling to work in Amsterdam when a 26-year-old Dutch-Moroccan man named Mohamed Bouyeri approached him on the street. Mohamed opened fire on Theo with a handgun, hitting him multiple times and wounding 2 bystanders in the process, and Theo ran to the other side of the road before falling to the ground in the cycle lane. Mohamed then walked up to him and shot him several more times at close range, then drew a knife and directed it at his throat. He then used a second knife to leave a letter on Theo's body, addressed to Ayaan, that contained threats against her and several other public figures. Theo, who was 47 years old, passed away at the scene. The RevolutionMuslim.com post included a graphic photograph of Theo's body taken shortly after the murder, placed directly alongside the text warning Trey and Matt they would probably end up the same way. But that wasn't everything the post contained. Alongside the photograph and the warning, Zachary and Jesse published what they described as the likely physical addresses of Trey and Matt's production company and of Comedy Central's offices. They also included a link to a 2009 article from the Huffington Post that detailed the location of Trey and Matt's personal home in Colorado, specifically so that readers could find where the men lived. Also embedded within the post was an audio recording of Anwar al-Awlaki, an American-born radical cleric then operating from hiding in Yemen, delivering a sermon that laid out the Islamic justification for killing those who insult the Prophet Muhammad. Jesse separately posted a speech asserting that Islam's position was that those who insult the Prophet may be killed, and he urged his listeners to fight the disbelievers near them. The Department of Justice would note that Zachary and Jesse had posted these speeches on multiple occasions and had also urged readers online to pay Trey and Matt a visit. When Fox News contacted Zachary after the post went live, he said he had written it to raise awareness, framing it as a way to put Trey and Matt on a list in the back of the minds of a large number of Muslims and calling that simply the reality. The reality Zachary described was something he had gradually come to believe over the years. He was born in December 22nd, 1989 in Charlottesville, Virginia, and grew up in Fairfax County after his parents divorced. At Kilmer Middle School in Vienna, he was placed in the gifted and talented program. At Oakton High School, he played football, basketball, and crew, and by 11th grade he had joined the school's breakdancing club, and he was, as his yearbook noted with some bemusement, the only Caucasian member, and he ultimately graduated high school in 2008. After graduation, Zachary enrolled at George Mason University and dropped out after a single semester. He took a job as a caretaker at the Islamic Center of Northern Virginia in Fairfax, and according to what he would tell FBI agents, his interest in Islam had begun in July 2008. His friends from high school told journalists the shift seemed to coincide with his dating a Muslim girl. Whatever the initial connection, by 2009, the change in him had become visible enough that members of the Islamic Center noticed it. An older member at the center told reporters he had tried to broaden Zachary's understanding of Islamic scripture, but that Zachary was unwilling to consider any interpretations beyond the most restrictive ones he had adopted. That same year, Zachary created a YouTube channel called Learn, Teach, Fight, Die, and a blog called mujidblog.com. He had also begun corresponding directly by email with Anwar, whose sermons had already been linked to at least one other domestic terrorist and whom the US government would formally designate as a terrorist before killing him in a drone strike in Yemen in September 2011. In April 2010, around the same time the South Park post went up, Zachary also wrote an email to Fox News in which he quoted Osama bin Laden and stated that if Muslims were killed, Muslims would kill in return. By this point, terrorism scholar Jared Brachman had a term for people like Zachary. In a 2008 book, Jared had coined the word jihobbyist for individuals who are deeply fascinated by jihadist ideology and becoming increasingly operational in their thinking but had never formally joined a terrorist organization. Jesse, the man who had created the platform Zachary was using, had taken a different route to the same place. He had once been a follower of the Grateful Dead, an American rock band whose devoted fan community became closely associated with the hippie movement before converting to Islam and eventually becoming immersed in radical online communities. He operated under the name Yones Abdullah Muhammad, alternatively spelled as Jonas Abdullah Muhammad, and had co-founded Revolution Muslim with Yosef, who had himself converted to Judaism. In a 2009 CNN interview, Yosef told the interviewer that Muslims were commanded by God to terrorize disbelievers, said that he loved bin Laden more than he loved himself, and defended the September 11 attacks as justified. He also told the interviewer he did not encourage violence on US soil, though the distinction he drew was a difficult one to follow. By 2010, Revolution Muslim had been investigated by CNN for its radical content, had published content calling for violence against Jewish organizations, and had been used to promote the ideology of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. When Zachary attached himself to the site, the two men began using it in a more specifically targeted way. Beyond the South Park post, they were also working in the same period to encourage violence against Molly Norris, a Seattle cartoonist who had proposed Everybody Draw Muhammad Day as a response to the censorship controversy the South Park post had itself set in motion. Al-Qaeda's English language magazine Inspire would eventually publish Molly's name and photograph in what it called a hit list. Jesse had also authorized Revolution Muslim to republish the first edition of Inspire in full, including an article entitled
How to Make a Bomb in the Kitchen of Your Mom.
None of it had gone unnoticed. The FBI had been watching both men for some time, though no arrests had come yet. Comedy Central's response to the revolutionmuslim.com post came before the follow-up episode had even aired. In the days between the post going up and the April 21st broadcast of 201, the New York City Police Department increased its security presence at Comedy Central's headquarters as a direct precaution. Law enforcement officials stated publicly that Revolution Muslim had no history of carrying out actual violence and was broadly considered all talk, but they added an important qualification. They were concerned the post could inspire individuals who encountered it to act on their own. When 201 finally broadcast on the night of April 21st, viewers saw what Comedy Central had decided to do. Every spoken reference to Muhammad's name was replaced by an audio bleep, and every frame in which the character appeared was covered by a large, censored rectangle. And then, in the closing minutes, when the show reached the sequence in which Kyle, Jesus Christ, and Santa Claus were meant to deliver their final remarks, the episode audio feed was replaced by an unbroken bleep that ran for the entirety of all three speeches. On April 22nd, 2010, Trey and Matt released a statement. In the 14 years they had been making South Park, they wrote, they had never done a show they couldn't stand behind. They had delivered their version of the episode to Comedy Central, and the network had altered it without their agreement.
It wasn't some meta joke on our part. Comedy Central added the bleeps.
They also noted that the silenced speech had actually been about
Kyle's customary final speech was about intimidation and fear. It didn't mention Muhammad at all, but it got bleeped too.
The network confirmed to reporters that it had been responsible for the censorship and declined to say anything further. 17 Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonists signed a petition protesting the threats in the days that followed. Roger Caitlin of the Hartford Courant wrote that
Comedy Central had drawn more attention to the Muhammad controversy rather than less by censoring the episode.
And UCLA law professor Eugene Volokh stated that
the network's decision risked giving future extremists a reason to repeat the tactic. The consequence of this position is that the thugs win, and people have more incentive to be thugs. There are lots of people out there who would very much like to get certain material removed, whether religious or political. The more they see others winning, the more they will be likely to do the same. Behavior that gets rewarded gets repeated.
Neither 200 nor 201 has ever been re-aired in the United States. Both episodes were removed from South Park's official streaming platform in the days after the April 21st broadcast. When Comedy Central's Swedish affiliate was presented with them, it declined to air them as well, releasing a statement explaining that
it had made the decision with great reluctance and that, while Comedy Central believes strongly in creative freedom of expression, the safety of its employees was its unquestioned #1 priority.
10 days after episode 201 aired, on May 1st, 2010, the NYPD discovered a car bomb near the eastern corner of One Astor Plaza in Times Square. One Astor Plaza was the world headquarters of Viacom, the parent company of Comedy Central, and for a moment, investigators wondered if it was connected to the South Park threats. It wasn't. The device had been planted by Faisal Shahzad, a neutralized American citizen with ties to the Pakistani Taliban, who was arrested and pleaded guilty to terrorism charges that had nothing to do with South Park at all. Zachary's involvement with the South Park case had not stopped at the revolutionmuslim.com post. He had continued threatening Trey and Matt on his personal blog and other platforms, each time pairing the content with references to Theo's murder as the intended outcome. But the threats against the show's creators, serious as they were, turned out to be only part of what Zachary had been building toward. On July 10th, 2010, Zachary arrived at a New York area airport and attempted to board a commercial flight. According to an FBI affidavit filed in federal court, he had specifically brought his infant son with him because he believed carrying a baby would make him appear less suspicious to authorities. His stated destination was Uganda, but his actual plan was to travel from there to Somalia, where he intended to join Al-Shabaab, which is a militant group aligned with Al-Qaeda that the US State Department has designated as a foreign terrorist organization in 2008. According to the same affidavit, Zachary had already tried to reach Somalia once before in November 2009, a trip that fell through when his wife couldn't get her passport in time. At the airport, the Transportation Security Administration informed him that he was on the federal no-fly list and he was not permitted to board, and with that, the agents detained him. 11 days later, on July 21st, 2010, Zachary was formally arrested by the FBI, though not for what he'd written about Trey and Matt. The arrest centered instead on material support, meaning direct aid or resources tied to his attempt to join Al-Shabaab in Somalia. The threats against Trey and Matt became a separate charge 3 months later, folded into his October guilty plea. His parents, according to the FBI affidavit, had stopped speaking to him entirely. The reason stated in the document was that ending life threats had been sent to them after Zachary posted his warnings about South Park. 4 days after Zachary's arrest, Jesse left the United States for Morocco. On October 20th, 2010, Zachary stood in the US District Court and pleaded guilty to 3 federal charges, and each one told a different part of what he'd actually been planning. The first, and the one most directly connected to South Park, was communicating threats against Trey and Matt, but it was the second charge that showed just how far his thinking had gone. He'd proposed planting harmless decoy packages in public spaces again and again until police stopped reacting to them seriously. That would clear the way for a real explosive device to be planted without drawing attention. Prosecutors built the count around the idea that Zachary was trying to wear down law enforcement's guard before an actual attack. The third one, however, was attempting to provide material support to Al-Shabaab, which in his case meant trying to join the group himself and becoming one of its fighters. Revolution Muslim's website was shut down in November 2010, about a month after Zachary's guilty plea. On February 24th, 2011, a federal judge sentenced Zachary to 25 years in federal prison. He was 21 years old at the time. Jesse, meanwhile, had settled in Morocco and continued his activities from there, running a successor website called islampolicy.com that promoted the same views under a different domain. US federal investigators were building a case against him in parallel. In May 2011, a federal guard jury in the East District of Virginia indicted Jesse on incitement to terrorism, meaning prosecutors accused him of pushing others toward violence, along with communicating threats. Moroccan authorities arrested him on May 26th of that year, stopping him on a street outside a mosque in Calabasca as he walked home toward his wife and 2 young sons. Moroccan officers reportedly told him that his problem was not with Morocco but with America, that he was wanted there as American Al-Qaeda, and that they were sending him home. The day before his extradition, Jesse emailed CNN a statement of nearly 6,000 words in which he disputed the charges entirely. Jesse described the case as part of what he called a broader Western war on Islam and said he was being imprisoned for something he was innocent of. He also characterized the revolutionmuslim.com post as having been intended to reduce the sensationalism around the episode, not to promote violence. Jesse was formally transferred to US custody in Rabat on October 28, 2011, and was back on American soil 3 days later. On November 4th, a federal court in Alexandria, Virginia ordered him detained pending trial. On February 9, 2012, Jesse pleaded guilty to conspiracy, meaning prosecutors said he'd agreed to work with others to carry out the plan, along with communicating threats and using the internet to intimidate. That same month, the US Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee put out a report that dug into Zachary's radicalization in detail, tracing his path from Fairfax County suburbs all the way to a federal penitentiary. The network Jesse had built through the site was connected to nearly 20 American and British individuals who were arrested in terrorism-related cases, including Colleen LaRose, known publicly as Jihad Jane, who had used the site and was charged with plotting to murder a Swedish cartoonist who had drawn Muhammad, the same act Revolution Muslim had threatened Trey and Matt over months earlier. At his sentencing on June 22, 2012, Jesse told the court that he had contributed to a clash of civilizations and acknowledged that he had justified atrocities by Muslims simply because they were carried out by the weak against the powerful. US District Judge Liam O'Grady told Jesse he was a bright man who had taken a horrible turn, and that there had to be religious tolerance in the world and freedom of speech. Prosecutor Gordon Cromberg, in summarizing the case, told the court that Jesse's philosophy could be reduced to a single line. Make a TV show we don't like, we'll knife your throat. Draw a cartoon we don't like, we'll knife your throat. Jesse was sentenced to 11 years and 6 months in federal prison. Yusuf, Revolution Muslim's co-founder, had left the organization in December 2009 before the South Park post went up, and had taken no part in what followed. He would describe what the website had become after his departure, calling it in a statement to CNN a bug light for Muslim misfits, and saying publicly that he regretted his message had been used as a justification to attack civilians. Looking back on it, he called it an idiotic thing. And around this time, an uncensored version of episode 201 was discovered on South Park Studios servers by a 4chan user in January 2014 and downloaded using a third-party tool before being shared online. Comedy Central has never acknowledged the leak. 5 months after that, in June 2014, Zachary was transferred to the ADX Florence Supermax prison in Colorado following repeated rule infractions at his original facility. According to the public prison records, he's scheduled to be released in 2032 due to his federal good conduct credits, which allow inmates to earn up to 54 days off their sentence per year, as well as the months he had already served between his arrest in July 2010 and his formal sentencing in February 2011. Jesse walked free in 2015, having served less than 4 years of his 11.5-year sentence, and it came at a price. As part of his plea deal, he'd agreed to sit down with the FBI and be debriefed on Revolution Muslim's network, offering ongoing insight into how Americans radicalize, and he kept assisting the Bureau and the wider Counterterrorism Committee even after his release. Yusuf was released on August 2nd, 2016, and with that, neither has been publicly active since. When South Park's full library was transferred to HBO Max in 2020, both episodes were among only 5 removed from the catalogue. South Park's 200th and 201st episodes have never been officially broadcast, streamed, or acknowledged again. The speech that Kyle was supposed to deliver in 201, the one about intimidation and fear that had nothing to do with Muhammad and still got bleeped anyway, has never been heard by the public in any authorized form. The warning that Zachary and Jesse said was not a threat had, in the end, worked exactly as they intended.